Certainly there's been complex music throughout the ages. I mean, you listen to the polyphony of Bach, you listen to the formal structures of Beethoven. This is extraordinarily complex music. But there was something very particular that happened. It was right after the Second World War, especially in Europe, where culture had collapsed, where the cultural institutions themselves that had been the homes to this music were, in many cases, completely in rubble. And composers like Stockhausen in particular, but Olivier Messiaen, for example, and in another kind of aesthetic pursuit, Yannis Xenakis, and composers of this generation, Toru Takemitsu in Japan, really sought to rebuild cultural life out of the ashes of the war. And the presumption, I think, was that a society, a fully functioning society, could be constructed in music in such a way that it could serve as a model for the rest of life. And so I think maybe more for that reason than anything else, what Stockhausen and others were interested in doing was extending the complexity that Bach reserved for polyphony into the entire realm of music. What Stockhausen really in particular wanted to do was to saturate the musical landscape with the same kind of complex organization that Bach reserved solely for the intertwining of lines and harmonic progressions. And so you get people, and I'll mention Stockhausen again, but he was not the only one there, who sought to leverage those same organizational principles against rhythm, against the changes of timbre, against orchestration, formal structure, so that everything could be organized in a kind of ideal, perhaps utopian way. This is a very short-lived period of musical history. I think by the time you get to the 1960s, most composers have given up this goal to make a perfectly ordered, ultimately rational society, which doesn't really work in the world of music, but which was an understandable reaction, I think, to the extreme disorder of the Second World War. And certainly you can say that music of the mid-20th century and onward, especially music of the immediate post-World War II generation of modernist composers, amplified the complexity of composition in manifold ways. I mean, look at what Stockhausen did to the serialism that he inherited from Weber. Look at what Xenakis did with random processes and stochastic methods. And you find this music which is dense and multi-rhythmic. And I once had a conversation with probably the grandfather, the godfather of complexity is Brian Ferneyhough, and we were talking about complexity, and he sort of gave me one of these looks, and he said, "But Steve, name one kind of music that's not complex. Name a single musical experience that doesn't have complexity in terms of its emotional impact or its sonic construction." But it's really true that with the late 20th century came an interest on the part of composers and listeners and performers alike to explore the outer reaches of what level of sophistication on rhythmic, formal, pitch, and harmonic levels a composition could have. And in some instances, there's extreme complexity in some of these compositions. I tend to think of this as a really optimistic way to compose music, because that music simply requires more than one listening. It is a music which is set up to metabolize more slowly. So if you come back to a piece of complex music 5 or 10 times, the way one would hope one could, then that music dissolves into the same kind of musical experience that one could have with superficially more simple music. It just requires multiple listenings and a greater attention to detail. I mean, it's really true that I think the relationship between simplicity and complexity is not a single spectrum. It feels much more like it's a bent scale that eventually merges, so that when you look at extremely complex music which on the page looks very, very complex, it sometimes elicits these very pure, almost simple emotional responses. Look what happens with the Grosse Fuge, which is an extraordinarily complex composition, and yet people are moved in sort of profound not sophisticated ways, but deep and human ways. And for me, when I listen to the end of Xenakis Persifasa, I feel moved in the same way. It's not my head that's involved, it's my heart. And the other way works. I can listen to Patsy Cline, and you can take a musical gesture, a way that Patsy Cline will deliver a text, and it seems so simple. And from that simplicity emanates this kind of incredible complexity of reactions that I have, memories and momentary reactions and fast forward thinking of how I might feel about that song in another 10 years. It all happens in a flash. Extremely complex relationship to this moment, which on the surface of things seems so simple. The only thing we have to fear with complexity is fear itself. I've spent a lot of my life, working on very complex rhythms and, sophisticated instrumental designs. But to me, the only thing that matters in music is whether it moves you or not. And the language of complex rhythms and those interactions, sometimes, rhythmic interactions between musical instruments, sometimes interactions with the sounds of the outside world, depending on the situation. Ultimately, none of that stuff counts unless it touches you. So what we're really actually constructing with those rhythms, whether they're complex or simple, is a kind of language. The question is, does that language speak to you? If it does, fantastic. If it doesn't, it's really not worth it.